They called him paranoid. A retired SWAT officer, living alone in the mountains, digging a shelter no one believed he'd ever need. Then, winter came early. A storm so violent it erased roads, crushed cabins, and buried everything under snow. Trapped, injured, completely alone. Except for one thing, a German shepherd who refused to let him die. And the shelter everyone laughed at. This is the story of the man they mocked, until winter proved him right. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. We're so curious about it. And if this story touches your heart, please make sure to subscribe for more. Your support truly means the world. Winter arrived early in the Colorado high country, slipping in on a silence so heavy it felt deliberate, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Jack Turner woke before dawn, the way he always did, not to an alarm but to the familiar ache in his left knee and the low pressure in the air that pressed against his temples like an unspoken warning. At 64, Jack was a retired SWAT officer, though the word retired never quite fit him. It implied rest, closure, a clean line between past and present, and Jack's life had never offered him any of those things. He lived alone in a weather-beaten cabin tucked deep into the foothills west of Leadville, Colorado, a place most people passed without noticing, and others avoided entirely once the snow began to fall. The cabin had belonged to a prospector decades earlier and still carried that same stubborn utilitarian feel. Thick pine beams darkened by time, narrow windows cut to conserve heat, and a roof reinforced not for beauty, but survival. Jack himself looked much the same. He was tall, a shade over 6 feet, though the years had compressed him slightly at the shoulders, as if the weight of responsibility had finally begun to press downward. His face was deeply lined, not with softness but with angles, high cheekbones, a squared jaw, and a scar that ran faintly from his right ear toward his chin, nearly hidden beneath a permanent shadow of gray stubble. His hair, once jet black, had faded to a steel gray kept cropped short out of habit, and his eyes were a pale, assessing blue that missed very little, even now. People who met Jack for the first time often mistook his quiet for coldness, but it was something else entirely. It was the stillness of a man who had learned that observation saved lives and unnecessary words did not. That awareness had been forged over 28 years on a metropolitan SWAT team, years marked by forced entries, hostage rescues, long standoffs, and the kind of decisions that stayed with a man long after the uniform was gone. One call in particular had changed Jack in ways he never spoke about, a winter operation gone wrong where hesitation cost a fellow officer his life. Jack had done everything by the book, but books did not bleed, and since that night, he trusted preparation more than luck, planning more than hope. The only living thing that shared his days now was Max, a German shepherd with a sable coat dusted lightly with gray around the muzzle, a sign of his own advancing years. Max was 9, broad-chested and powerfully built, with intelligent amber eyes that tracked Jack's movements constantly, not out of neediness, but discipline. He had been trained as a K-9 in his younger years, not for patrol, but for support work. Search assistance, perimeter awareness, and later emotional grounding when Jack's sleep fractured into short, uneasy bursts. Max moved with a controlled confidence, ears always half-cocked, tail low but steady, and when he sat, he did so with a straight-backed posture that mirrored Jack's own unconscious habits. To outsiders, he might have looked intimidating, but there was a gentleness to him, a patience that revealed itself in the way he leaned his weight just slightly into Jack's leg during moments of stillness, anchoring him to the present. That morning, as Jack pulled on his thermal layers and stepped onto the porch, Max followed, nose lifted to the wind, breathing deeply. The air smelled wrong, not simply cold, but sharp, metallic, charged. Snow lay already knee-deep in the clearing, and the tree line beyond the cabin stood unnaturally still, their branches heavy as if waiting. Jack scanned the sky, noting the thin, fast-moving clouds at high altitude and the darker mass forming low over the western ridge. He did not need a forecast to know what was coming. For weeks he had felt it in his joints, in the way the wildlife had retreated downslope earlier than usual, in the silence that crept in after dusk. Winter was not just arriving, it was settling in. Jack turned back inside, moving with deliberate efficiency, checking supplies not for the first time, but with the ritual seriousness of a man who knew complacency killed. Canned food, dried meat, water purification tablets, medical kits, spare fuel, batteries, everything was in place. What no one in town knew, and what Jack had no intention of advertising, was what lay beneath the cabin itself. Over the past year, working alone and carefully, Jack had excavated and reinforced a subterranean shelter carved into the rocky earth below the frost line. It was not elaborate, but it was solid. Concrete reinforced walls, insulated panels, a ventilation system that vented through natural rock fissures, and a secondary access hatch hidden beneath a false section of floor. He had designed it the way he approached everything else, with redundancy, restraint, and an understanding that if you needed it, it might already be too late to build it. The few neighbors scattered miles away had noticed his supply runs, the reinforced supports, the constant maintenance, and they had talked, as people always did. Some said Jack had gone paranoid after retirement, others that isolation had finally caught up with him. Jack did not correct them. He had learned long ago that convincing people was rarely worth the effort, and besides, this was not for them. It was for moments exactly like this, as the first real gust of wind slammed into the cabin, rattling the windows and sending loose snow swirling into white spirals. Max stiffened, a low sound forming in his chest. Jack rested a gloved hand on the dog's broad neck, feeling the steady warmth there, and for a brief moment, something like calm settled over him. He thought of the city he had left behind, of concrete streets and radio chatter, of teammates whose faces had blurred with time but whose voices still surfaced in his dreams. He had come here to be alone, yes, but also to listen, to the land, to the weather, to the instincts he had once trusted with everything. Outside, the sky darkened rapidly, the kind of sudden shift that left no doubt. Snow began to fall again, heavier this time, driven sideways by a wind that cut through layers like it was measuring them. Jack moved without hesitation, securing the cabin, checking the hatch, and running through contingencies in his head, not with fear but focus. Max stayed close, tracking every movement, every sound. Somewhere deep inside Jack, beneath the aches and the memories, there was a quiet certainty taking shape. Whatever was coming, he would not be caught unprepared. Winter had found him again, but this time he was ready. The town of Redemption Ridge sat 30 minutes down the mountain from Jack Turner's cabin, a scatter of weathered buildings pressed together as if for warmth, and it was there that Jack's quiet preparations became something people talked about. He came into town once a week, always on the same day, always at the same hour, driving his aging pickup with the same deliberate caution he applied to everything else. The men at the gas station noticed first. Jack loaded fuel cans even when the sky was clear, reinforced straps cinched tight across the truck bed, his movements efficient, unsmiling. Someone chuckled. Someone else shook his head. Word traveled faster than snowmelt in a mountain town, and soon everyone had an opinion about the retired SWAT officer who lived alone above the tree line and acted like the world was about to end. At Murphy's Hardware, where the smell of oil and old lumber lingered in the air, Jack crossed paths with Frank Doyle, a former construction foreman in his late 50s, broad-shouldered with a thick belly and a permanent 5 o'clock shadow that never quite faded. Frank had the easy confidence of a man who'd never left this place, whose life followed predictable seasons. "Stocking up again, Jack?" he asked, leaning against the counter, amusement softening his voice. Jack nodded once. "Winter's coming in hard." Frank laughed, not unkindly. "Winter always comes. You act like it's different this time." Jack didn't argue. He had learned that explanations rarely changed minds, especially when they challenged comfort. Outside, Max waited patiently in the truck, head resting near the open window, ears twitching as voices passed by. His amber eyes tracked movement constantly, alert even in stillness. On the drive back up the mountain, the radio crackled with a brief weather bulletin, vague and cautious, mentioning pressure anomalies and potential heavy snowfall at higher elevations. The broadcaster's tone was calm, almost dismissive. Jack turned the volume down. He had heard that tone before, back when storms were measured in inches instead of consequences. Over the next few days, the jokes sharpened. A hand-painted sign appeared briefly outside the diner. Jack Turner's end-of-the-world sale, before someone took it down. Laughter followed him in small, careless waves, never directly to his face, but always close enough to hear. Jack took it in without reaction. His face remained composed, but inside, memories stirred. He remembered briefings where warnings were minimized, where caution was mistaken for fear, and how quickly confidence evaporated when things went wrong. Back at the cabin, Max's behavior grew more focused. He spent long minutes at the hatch area, nose pressed close to the floor, inhaling slowly, then lifting his head toward the door, as if tracking something invisible. At night, he paced instead of sleeping, nails clicking softly against the wood, ears pricked at sounds Jack barely registered. Jack watched him closely. In all their years together, Max had never acted without reason. That alone carried weight. Jack adjusted his routine, reinforcing seals, double-checking ventilation, and marking time mentally, not by dates, but by signs. The way the wind shifted direction abruptly at dusk, the unnatural clarity of the stars before cloud cover rolled in, the absence of birds where there should have been movement. Mid-week, he received an unexpected visit. Sheriff Alan Mercer drove up in a marked SUV, tires crunching loudly against frozen gravel. Mercer was in his early 60s, lean to the point of gauntness, with deeply set brown eyes and a mustache gone mostly white. His uniform sat loosely on him, a reminder of years spent working alone across wide stretches of land. He and Jack had known each other only in passing, respectful nods exchanged over paperwork and quiet mutual understanding between men who'd both seen enough. "Heard you've been busy," Mercer said after Jack invited him inside. His tone wasn't mocking, but curious. Jack poured coffee without asking and slid a mug across the table. "Just getting ready." Mercer glanced around the cabin, taking in the reinforced beams, the careful order, Max sitting alert but calm at Jack's side. "People are talking," he said finally. "They're always talking," Jack replied. Mercer gave a faint smile. "Weather Service doesn't seem too worried." Jack met his gaze steadily. "They never are until it's already happening." Mercer studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, as if filing something away. He didn't press further. When he left, the wind had picked up noticeably, carrying snow in short, aggressive bursts. That night, Jack stood on the porch with Max beside him, watching clouds swallow the moon. Somewhere deep in the forest, a tree cracked under its own weight. Max growled softly, not in fear, but warning. Jack rested a hand on the dog's neck, feeling the tension there, shared and understood. Below them, the town lights glowed faintly, unaware and unconcerned. Above them, the mountain gathered itself. Jack did not feel anger at the laughter, nor pride in his preparations. What he felt was resolve. He had seen this pattern before: disbelief, dismissal, then regret. If the price of being ready was being mocked, it was a cost he had paid before. As the wind rose and snow began to fall with renewed force, Jack turned back inside, sealing the door behind him. Max followed without hesitation. Outside, winter continued its quiet advance, indifferent to jokes, unmoved by opinion, and very close now. The storm arrived without ceremony, not with drama, but with inevitability, rolling over the mountain like a closing door that could not be reopened. Jack Turner sensed it before the first true gust struck the cabin, felt it in the sudden drop in pressure that made his ears ring, and in the way the silence outside thickened until even the wind seemed to hesitate. Snow began falling just after dusk, heavy flakes at first, slow and deliberate, then faster, denser, driven sideways by a wind that sharpened with every passing minute. Jack moved through the cabin with controlled urgency, securing shutters, reinforcing the door braces, running a final systems check not because he doubted his preparation, but because discipline demanded it. Max stayed close, body tense, paws planted wide for balance as the floor vibrated faintly beneath each growing gust. The dog's ears flicked constantly, tracking sounds Jack could barely distinguish. The distant crack of trees bending too far, the low rolling thunder of snow shifting on steep slopes. By nightfall, visibility dropped to nothing. The world beyond the windows dissolved into white motion, and the wind screamed like something alive, hurling itself against the cabin walls with blind persistence. Jack keyed the radio once more out of habit. Static answered him. The power flickered, held for a moment, then died completely, plunging the cabin into a thick, unnatural darkness, broken only by the beam of his headlamp. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself, and turned toward the back room where the generator was housed. The floor there had always been colder, the boards older, and as he stepped forward, the cabin shuddered violently under a sudden impact. Wind or something heavier, he couldn't tell. The jolt threw him off balance. His left foot slid, his knee twisted sharply, and pain exploded up his leg, white-hot and immediate. Jack hit the floor hard, breath driven from his lungs, teeth clenched against a sound he refused to make. For a moment, he lay there, the storm roaring around him, every instinct screaming to move even as his body resisted. That hesitation, brief, dangerous, was when Max reacted. The German shepherd rushed to him, not panicked, but precise, teeth gripping the thick strap of Jack's vest, tugging insistently. Max did not try to drag him outright. Instead, he pulled, released, repositioned, his weight pressing forward, urging movement with urgent purpose. Jack recognized the behavior instantly. It was trained response layered over instinct, the same technique Max had once used to guide injured officers out of unstable structures. Jack forced himself upright, leaning heavily on the wall as another violent impact shook the cabin, followed by a deep, crushing sound that resonated through the beams. Outside, something gave way. The realization came with brutal clarity. The slope above the cabin had failed. Snow, ice, and debris slammed into the structure with unstoppable force, wood splintering, the roof groaning under sudden weight. Jack did not waste time arguing with his own pain. He reached for the concealed latch beneath the floor panel, fingers shaking not with fear but exertion, and threw it open as Max barked sharply, the sound cutting through the storm like a command. Together, they moved, Jack half limping, half falling, down into the narrow stairwell that led beneath the cabin. The moment they crossed the threshold, the world above them collapsed. The sound was deafening, a violent roar, followed by a pressure wave that knocked Jack against the concrete wall of the shelter. Dust filled the air. The hatch slammed shut under the weight of snow and debris, sealing them in darkness so complete it felt physical. Jack lay still for several seconds, chest heaving, listening past the ringing in his ears. Slowly, other sounds emerged, the steady hum of reinforced supports holding, the controlled intake of air through the ventilation system, Max's breathing close and fast but alive. Jack switched on the emergency lights. The shelter glowed dimly, revealing intact walls, secured shelves, and the narrow space he had built for exactly this moment. Above them, the cabin was gone. There was no doubt now. They were buried. Jack shifted carefully, testing his injured knee. Pain flared, but the joint held. He swallowed hard, aware of what that pain represented. Mobility would be limited. Every decision from here on would carry weight. Max sat beside him, eyes locked on Jack's face, waiting. Jack rested his hand on the dog's neck, grounding himself in the warmth there. He did not allow himself panic. Panic wasted oxygen. Instead, he assessed. The storm was still raging. The hatch would not be passable until the snow settled, possibly not for days. No one knew they were here. The radio was useless. Above ground, the mountain had erased them without hesitation. Jack felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not fear, but responsibility. He had chosen this isolation. He had prepared for it. Now, the cost was real. Somewhere above, wind howled over fresh ruin, indifferent and unrelenting. In the shelter, Jack adjusted the lights, checked Max for injuries, and began the careful process of rationing time, energy, and hope. Winter had made its move, and it had come for him personally. Jack Turner did not know how long they would be trapped, but one thing was certain as he settled against the cold concrete wall, pain pulsing steadily through his knee. This was no longer about preparation in theory. This was survival, and it had already begun. Time lost its edges underground. Without daylight to mark its passage, hours blurred into a steady rhythm of breath, movement, and restraint. Jack Turner measured it by systems checks and pain levels, by the way his knee stiffened if he stayed still too long and loosened only slightly after careful motion. The storm still raged above them, its presence felt through distant vibrations that traveled down the rock like muffled thunder. The shelter held, just as Jack had designed it to, but survival was no longer theoretical. It was immediate and unforgiving. Max adapted quickly, settling into a watchful routine, lying near the ventilation intake with his head raised, ears rotating subtly as if reading a language Jack could not hear. On the second night, or what Jack believed to be the second night, Max rose abruptly, body rigid, nose lifted toward the narrow concrete wall where one of the secondary vents ran upward through the mountain. He sniffed once, then again, deeper this time, and let out a low, insistent whine. Jack froze. In all their years together, Max never vocalized without cause. Jack shut down the main lights and switched to the low-output emergency lamps, listening. At first, there was nothing. Then, faint but unmistakable, came a sound that did not belong to the mountain, a hollow scrape, followed by a weak, broken cough. Jack's jaw tightened. Someone was out there. The realization settled heavily in his chest. The secondary vent system had been built with emergency access in mind, narrow fissures that could be widened from the inside if necessary, but opening it now carried risk. Heat loss, structural compromise, exposure. Jack weighed those risks the way he had once weighed entry options during hostage calls, knowing that hesitation could be as deadly as action. Max moved closer to the wall, pawing once, then looking back at Jack with unmistakable urgency. That decided it. Jack retrieved the pry bar and thermal mask, moving slowly, deliberately, ignoring the flare of pain in his knee. As he loosened the internal seal, cold air rushed in, sharp and biting, carrying with it the smell of snow, blood, and pine sap. The opening revealed a man wedged awkwardly against the rock, half-conscious, his breath shallow and uneven. He was in his early 40s, lean but powerfully built, with a dark beard crusted with ice and wind-burned skin pulled tight over high cheekbones. His hair, dark brown and matted with snow, clung to his forehead beneath a torn wool cap. One arm hung at an unnatural angle, the sleeve soaked through with blood that had already begun to freeze. His eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused, but alive. "Don't move," Jack said firmly, his voice steady, practiced. The man groaned faintly. Jack worked efficiently, anchoring a line and guiding the man inward inch by inch, Max assisting not by force but by position, pressing his body where warmth was needed, steadying when the injured man faltered. Once inside, Jack sealed the vent as tightly as conditions allowed and turned his full attention to the stranger. The man's name was Ethan Caldwell, a solo backcountry hunter who had underestimated the storm and paid for it. He was 6 feet tall, all muscle and endurance, built for long days outdoors. But exposure had stripped that strength down to raw vulnerability. His left arm was fractured, ribs bruised, and early hypothermia had already dulled his responses. As Jack stabilized the arm and wrapped him in thermal blankets, he noted the signs with clinical detachment tempered by empathy. Ethan's eyes tracked him weakly. "Thought I was done," he rasped. Jack met his gaze. "You weren't. Not today." The next hours were consumed by careful work. Jack rationed heat, adjusted airflow, and redistributed supplies with the precision of a man who understood margins. Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness, pain pulling him under, then releasing him just long enough to drink water or answer a question. Max remained close, occasionally resting his head against Ethan's leg, a quiet, grounding presence. When the immediate crisis passed, reality settled in. 3 living beings now shared a shelter stocked for 1 man and a dog. Jack sat back against the wall, exhaustion finally catching up to him. He felt the familiar weight of command settle onto his shoulders, heavier now because there was no team to delegate to, no backup coming. Ethan broke the silence eventually, his voice hoarse but sincere. "They said you were crazy," he murmured. Jack didn't look up. "People say a lot of things." Outside, the mountain remained sealed, the storm unrelenting. Jack knew the decision he had made would complicate everything that followed. Supplies would stretch thinner, recovery would be slower, risks would multiply. But as he watched Ethan's breathing steady and felt Max's quiet vigilance beside him, Jack also knew something else, something just as clear. He had not survived his career by ignoring responsibility when it presented itself. Saving 1 life had always been worth the cost. In the darkness beneath the mountain, with winter pressing down from all sides, Jack Turner accepted the consequences of his choice. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The first sign that winter was loosening its grip was not light, but sound. Jack Turner noticed it during what he believed was the 42nd day underground, when the mountain no longer groaned under constant pressure, and the wind's distant howl softened into something intermittent, almost uncertain. The shelter had become a world measured in routines, rationed meals eaten slowly, controlled movements to conserve Jack's injured knee, and the careful monitoring of Ethan Caldwell's recovery as bruising faded from purple to yellow and his breathing deepened into something steady and reliable. Max adjusted as well, settling into a protective rhythm, alternating between quiet vigilance at the ventilation intake and long stretches pressed against Jack's side, warmth shared without demand. Jack had not allowed himself hope, only discipline, but even discipline could not ignore change. On the morning the vibrations ceased entirely, replaced by a muted stillness that felt different from the suffocating quiet of entrapment, Jack knew the storm cycle had finally broken. He powered up the thermal sensor 1 last time, its faint display showing irregular temperature patterns above, voids where snow had shifted, air pockets forming. Somewhere beyond the rock and ice, the world was moving again. What Jack did not know was that movement had begun days earlier below the mountain as well. In Redemption Ridge, when the storms finally relented enough to allow flight and ground patrols, Sheriff Alan Mercer had reopened the missing persons reports that had quietly accumulated during the blackout weeks. Among them were Jack Turner and Ethan Caldwell. Mercer, thinner now and visibly worn, stood out in the cold morning air as rescue teams prepared equipment. He had not forgotten the retired SWAT officer who had spoken calmly while everyone else laughed. He pointed toward the slope above Jack's cabin. "If anyone built something that could still be standing up there," Mercer said quietly, "it's him." The rescue effort was slow and methodical. Thermal drones swept the area first, their sensors tuned to detect anomalies beneath the snowpack. For hours, nothing appeared but uniform cold. Then, a technician froze, staring at the monitor. A faint, persistent heat signature pulsed deep beneath where the cabin had once stood. It was too steady to be geological. It was alive. Jack heard the digging before he believed it. At first, it sounded like memory, an echo of his own thoughts, but then Max lifted his head sharply, ears forward, tail rising in cautious excitement. The sound grew clearer, metal striking compacted snow, voices muffled but unmistakably human. Jack closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in relief, but acknowledgement. The system had held. Time had held. When the first shaft of daylight broke through the emergency hatch, it cut into the shelter like something unreal, blinding and beautiful. Cold air rushed in, but it was clean, breathable, and alive. Rescuers emerged slowly, their faces registering disbelief as they took in the reinforced walls, the organized supplies, the 3 living beings who should not have existed there anymore. Jack was helped to his feet carefully, his knee protesting but holding. Ethan was carried out on a stretcher, conscious and smiling weakly despite the pain. Max walked out under his own power, head high, eyes alert, pausing once to look back at the shelter before stepping into the light. Above ground, the mountain looked reshaped, stripped and raw but alive. The cabin was gone entirely, reduced to splintered memory beneath meters of snow. Jack took it in without grief. Structures could be rebuilt, lives could not. News of their survival spread quickly. In town, disbelief turned into something quieter and heavier. The jokes stopped. People listened. Jack did not seek recognition, but it came anyway, first in the form of handshakes, then quiet nods of respect. The county formally designated the shelter as an emergency refuge, allocating resources to expand and maintain it for future storms. Jack accepted the offer with conditions, clear rules, shared responsibility, no shortcuts. Ethan recovered fully in the months that followed, returning often, his gratitude expressed not in words but in labor, helping reinforce access routes and emergency markings. As for Jack, he did not leave the mountain. He rebuilt, slower now, with Max always close, but something inside him had shifted. For the first time since leaving the force, he felt not isolated, but placed. Winter had tested him, mocked him through others, and then tried to erase him. It had failed. On a quiet morning months later, with snow melting into steady streams and birds returning cautiously to the trees, Jack stood outside the shelter entrance, Max at his side, and allowed himself a single rare smile. Preparation had not made him a hero. It had simply kept him alive long enough to do what he had always done. Be ready. And when it mattered most, refuse to turn away. This story reminds us that preparation is not fear, and caution is not weakness. In everyday life, we are often laughed at for planning ahead, for thinking about risks others choose to ignore, or for taking responsibility before trouble arrives. Yet when real hardship comes, whether it's a sudden crisis, a health challenge, financial uncertainty, or a moment when someone else needs help, it's preparation, discipline, and quiet integrity that carry us through. Like Jack, we don't prepare because we expect disaster every day, but because life doesn't announce its hardest moments in advance. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to the channel to keep these stories alive. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide your steps, and thank you so much for watching and Happy New Year.